All right. Well, I want to just dive in, and we're going to be in Matthew 18, looking in verses 21 through 35. Mostly, that's where we're going to spend a majority of our time. So let's read those verses together, that parable about forgiveness. Then Peter came to him and asked, "Lord, how often should I forgive someone who sins against me? 7 times?" "No, not 7 times," Jesus replied, "but 70 times 7. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who decided to bring his accounts up to date with servants who had borrowed money from him. In the process, one of his debtors was brought in who owed him millions of dollars. He couldn't pay, so his master ordered that he be sold along with his wife, his children, and everything he owed to pay the debt. But the man fell down before his master and begged him, 'Please be patient with me, and I will pay it all.' Then his master was filled with pity for him, and he released him and forgave his debt. But when the man left the king, he went out to a fellow servant. My eyes jumped down. When the man left the king, he went to a fellow servant who owed him a few $1,000s. He grabbed him by the throat and demanded instant payment. His fellow servant fell down before him and begged for a little more time. 'Be patient with me, and I will pay it,' he pleaded. But his creditor wouldn't wait. He had the man arrested and put in prison until the debt could be paid in full. When some of the other servants saw this, they were very upset. They went to the king and told him everything that had happened. Then the king called in the man he had forgiven, and said, 'You evil servant, I forgave you that tremendous debt because you pleaded with me. Shouldn't you have mercy on your fellow servant, just as I had mercy on you?' Then the angry king sent the man to prison to be tortured until he had paid his entire debt. That's what my heavenly Father will do to you if you refuse to forgive your brothers and sisters from your heart." A parable about forgiveness, right? A remarkable parable in so many ways. Well, as we begin, it's not working. I don't know why. Go to the first point for me, if you will. Thank you. We're going to talk about the details of the parable to begin, because it's in looking at the details that we find the teaching here, the lesson that is so important. It is a remarkable parable. And I think it's even more remarkable in the light of just how comical it would have been understood to the first century listeners of Jesus telling this story at this time. The details provide the importance of this parable. So let's look at the amount of money owed by each slave for just a moment to begin with. The first slave, literally in the Greek, it said he owes a myriad of talents. Now, my translation, the New Living Translation, goes ahead and does an interpretation of that for us. What does that mean, a myriad of talents? We don't use talents for money anymore. We don't really use the word myriad a whole bunch except to mean a lot. But in Greek, myriad was literally the highest number that they had in their language. It meant 10,000. A myriad is what that meant. Talent was the highest amount of money that a person could have, or that anybody could have. And so Jesus is using this language very particularly. It's almost like we would be saying something like, this person owed a gazillion dollars. Well, what does that mean to us? Well, one, gazillion's not a real number. We all get that. But what do we mean by that? It's hyperbole, right? It means they owe a debt that they could never, ever possibly even begin to think about paying. The fact that an individual would owe this much money is just astronomically comical to Jesus and the hearers. The rough equivalent of this would be that this man owes 150,000 years worth of money at that time. Yes, you heard me correctly. I said 150,000 years worth of money at that time. Again, we're talking about a comical kind of number. And even in the New Living Translation that says he owed millions of dollars, which, to us would be a lot of, just a whole lot of money, that doesn't even really fully grasp the situation that Jesus is setting up in the story. it's not just millions of dollars. This man owes multiple trillions upon trillions upon trillions of dollars in this scenario. It's just quite silly to think about it in those terms. So what about the other servant? It says that he owes 100 denarii. Well, that is 100 days worth of income. Now that's still a significant amount of money, right? If we all think back to, working and what we make on a daily basis, you take that, that's about 3 months worth of pay. That's not an insignificant amount of money for us. I would venture to guess that most people in here, if you went without 3 months worth of pay, that would be a significant hit to your bank accounts, right? You would feel that financially. This is not an insignificant amount of money. But it's quite comical to think about 100 days worth and 150,000 years worth of income. The span, the gap there is so large. It's so huge. The people hearing this story would get the point immediately. Oh, the second man essentially owed nothing. To us, it seems like a lot. But really, he owed nothing compared to the initial servant. And so Jesus tells the story like a good storyteller does, and he hooks them in with kind of a joke to begin with. Hey, there was this guy who owed this king some money, but not just some money. He owed 150,000 years worth of money. And they all begin to laugh. Yeah, right. That's crazy. Jesus is being a good storyteller in this moment. Another striking detail in this parable, though, is how the first slave responds to the king. Did you pick up on that? How does he respond to the king? The king says, hey, you owe me 150,000 years worth of debt, setting aside the fact that anybody could ever get into that much debt, again, is quite silly. But let's say that he really did. Let's say this weren't a parable and this were a real story. How does he respond? I'm so sorry. I'll pay it back. Huh? What are you ever going to do in your life? How could you ever begin to think that you could possibly make 150,000 years worth of money in the span of one lifetime? It's just not happening, right? So we see already, and this is going to be borne out in how he treats his fellow slave. Already we see this man not get it, right? He doesn't understand the point of what the king is doing. He thinks his job is to pay back what he's owed, when the king is completely shifting that around. We're going to look at that here a little bit more in a moment. And this servant ends up failing his own test of forgiveness here very shortly. So I want to talk about the characters here for a moment and what they teach us. The first servant fails his test precisely because he doesn't understand how the master is changing the rules of the game. So just like in our day, it was true back then as well. The rules of bookkeeping. You do for me, I do for you. Give and get, right? If you take care of me, I'll take care of you. It's a constant exchange of goods and services and money, finances, all over the place. The rules of bookkeeping, we get it. We even have programs based on this kind of thing, spreadsheets. Let me put together this graph, this chart that tracks the money so that I know I've got a ledger proving, okay, here's what you gave me, here's what I've been paying back to you, so that we're all square, right? The rules of bookkeeping, we get it. We get it. And I'm thankful that Lyle gets it. That's how I get paid. I'm very thankful that we have it in some ways. But did you notice the rules of bookkeeping? That's not how the master is in the game. Did you notice that? He's completely changed the way the game works. And how does this parable begin? The kingdom of heaven could be compared to this kind of situation. And if we're to assume, and I think we are rightly to assume, that God is king, then what is the king doing? He's changing the rules about what it looks like to try to pay back some kind of debt to God. The master in this moment is literally saying something like, to hell with the rules that you've been living by. Literally, I'm going to place those in hell. Remember a few weeks ago, I talked about Jesus coming to earth to get the hell out of earth, to get the hell out of us. That's what he's saying to the rules here. I'm sending those to the trash heap, to Gehenna, to the place where they belong. Those kind of rules have no place in my kingdom. The kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God is not built on the way that you live your life. It's not built on that retribution that we want to get, that vengeance that we have when somebody doesn't pay us back. We get angry because they've wronged us and they've hurt us. That's not the kingdom of God. The Master here is instituting a new way of living in the world. And notice, he doesn't do this based on the man's response, right? He didn't send the first slave off for a couple of months and say, okay, start. I'm going to give you 3 months to figure out how you're going to try to do this. And if you don't give me some progress in a few months, I'm cutting you off. You're done. It's not how we respond to the situation, right? And then a few months later, the man comes back and he's made a little bit back, and so the master goes, I'm so proud of you. Thank you. You know what? I'm just going to forgive it all because you were a hard worker. No. This man does not deserve forgiveness in this moment. He doesn't deserve mercy. He's squandered this wealth that this master has. And the master says, okay, it's forgiven. Welcome to my kingdom. A really ludicrous kind of way to do business, right? I mean, that doesn't make good fiscal sense. Imagine if our country... Oh, wait, that is how we run our country. Never mind. All right. The servant leaves the presence of the master, and he can't let go of the rules of bookkeeping. Did you notice that too? When he left, what is he still holding on to? I'm going to get what belongs to me. He's still trying to live by the old way. He can't seem to get what this kingdom of heaven is like. And so we see that the kingdom of heaven is about a new way of being in the world, a new way of ordering the world. And that's what Jesus came to set right. So let's talk about forgiveness then for a moment, as we've set up the details of the story and the individuals themselves. What is forgiveness then in this moment? This is precisely why we need forgiveness, because we don't live under the old way of living in the world any longer. Because forgiveness is about making things right God's way and not the world's way. And I believe this starts with humility, which is how chapter 18 begins. We're going to go back to that in a moment. This picture I have of Jesus sitting with the child, this is how this chapter begins. And I don't think it's any accident that Matthew has put these stories together in this way. Forgiveness is about letting go of the wrong someone has done toward you, or that you have done toward yourself. Notice I said toward yourself as well. Forgiveness is about letting go of the wrongs done toward you and that you've done toward yourself. And what Jesus says in the story in response to Peter's question, right? Peter directly asks Jesus a question. How many times should I forgive somebody? It's a good question to ask, right? I think it's one that we probably all want an answer to, or would have wanted an answer to if Peter himself hadn't asked us the question. He gets to look like the idiot, and we just get to learn from him, right? This is a question we would all want to know an answer to. But Jesus says in response to that in this community of forgiven people, of brothers and sisters, us, that we must be a forgiving community. And he's already made this point way back in chapter 6 at the end of the Lord's Prayer. I don't know if you remember that. But he gives that teaching flesh and bone here in chapter 18. And so we see Jesus providing his own standard for forgiveness. And there were rabbis around at the time of Jesus who were teaching that 3 times. If you forgive somebody 3 times of the same sin toward you, you fulfilled your duty toward them. They say that on the 4th time, you can be done forgiving them. They have wronged you too many times. You should not forgive past 3. So I think Peter is probably thinking he's really quite, magnanimous here in this moment. Jesus, 7 times is good, right? Not 3. We're better than 3 times. We're the community of Jesus. 3's not enough for us. We'll go to 7. He's probably feeling pretty good about himself in this moment, isn't he? And Jesus goes, no. That's not what it's about here. Nope, I don't tell you 7 times. I tell you 77 times, or 7 times 70. And you probably notice in different translations it's rendered differently. And there's a reason for that. The Greek is very unclear. And I almost wonder if Jesus spoke in this way, purposefully vague, Because the point isn't about the number. It's not about whether it's 77 or 490, as lots of people have debated and fought over for years and years. That can't be the point. In fact, if you're still talking about that, and if you're doing the whole tick mark thing, well, there's one, there's two. And once you get up to 490, you're done. Jesus said 490, I can quit now. Then you've missed the point of forgiveness completely. If the number is all it's about, that's what Jesus is trying to say. If the number is all it's about, you've completely missed the point of the story and of what forgiveness is. A disciple's forgiveness, our forgiveness. And I'm talking about the community of believers here. I'm not talking about people who don't submit to God like we do. I'm not talking about people who haven't given their life to Christ. They live by the rules of bookkeeping. We don't. Our community lives differently, or at least it ought to. A disciple's forgiveness should be unlimited. That's what Jesus is saying. There is no limit to the number of times that we should be forgiving of each other. But it's hard to leave that life of bookkeeping behind, isn't it? The rules of the world follow us into this space, don't they? At least they often do. But Jesus is telling us about a different way. The kingdom of heaven is different than that. And so the magnitude of God's amazing and saving grace is the proper model for forgiveness, which is the point of the parable. And it's interesting, there are actually two motivating factors here at play in this story, I think. They are fear and gratitude. They both come up here. We ought to be eternally grateful, right? Our gratitude toward God should be never-ending for His forgiveness of us, right? But what else is a motivating factor here but fear? What if we are not forgiving of each other? What does it say? What does Jesus say? Jesus says that God then will not be forgiving toward you. If a Christian is not willing to forgive a brother or sister who is themselves a fellow sinner, then why should we expect differently from God? If we can't treat each other with that kind of mercy and grace and love and forgiveness, why should we expect God to treat us that way? So the question to me then is, what keeps us from forgiving, from being forgiving people? And here I would argue that it is unchildishness. Not childishness, but unchildishness. Here's what I mean by that. What does becoming like a child have to do with forgiveness? Well, I already mentioned that Jesus started this chapter, or chapter 18 starts with the moment where Jesus brings this little child, because the disciples are fighting. They're having this argument. Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? It's me, right? Peter probably says. James and John, wait, we've been there every moment with you. No, we're really good. I mean, come on. We're not so bad ourselves. Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And it's interesting, if you ask somebody what Jesus means by this statement, that you have to become like a little child, you may get one of several different responses. I've heard a lot. A couple, just to say, I've heard some answer that Jesus is intending for us to understand and recognize the innocence of a child. They're innocent, aren't they? Until you've raised children, and then you realize how dumb a statement that is. But that's what a lot of people say. A lot of people think that Jesus is talking about their innocence. They're sweet, they're kind, they're innocent. Or about their purity, they respond, their children are pure in the eyes of God. They have done no wrong yet, and so they have no need to be forgiven. They're pure. Is that what Jesus says here in this moment? No. Go back and look at chapter 18 very early on. He brings this child among them, and he says in verse 4, anyone who becomes as humble as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. It's not about innocence. It's not about purity. It's about humility. And that, I think, is the root of somebody not being a forgiving person. So they lack humility. They are unchildish. Jesus wants us to be childish, meaning He wants us to be humble. A person who is unchildish, who is not humble, who is prideful and arrogant, is somebody who is unforgiving. So I don't think it's any coincidence that here Jesus says, anyone who becomes as humble as a little child is the greatest where? In the kingdom of heaven. And what does he start the parable with? The kingdom of heaven could be compared to, there's a link there, right? There's something connecting these two moments. So I don't think it's any coincidence that this is happening, because I think forgiveness requires that one be humble. Forgiveness requires that you set aside your own desires for divine retribution that you want blasted down upon your enemies. Because they've wronged you and they've hurt you, and so God, smite them with all the power that you have. We feel that way sometimes. That's not what being a Christian is about. What's interesting is there's actually no special word for forgiveness in Greek. The root comes from the Greek verb that simply means to let go of something. That's where the word forgiveness in English comes from. It's a Greek verb that means to let go. You can't let go if you're not humble. You can't let go if you're holding on to it because of your pride and your arrogance. So Jesus told his disciples to be humble because he knew that would be a necessary piece for them to be a forgiving people. He knew they need humility if they were to follow his instructions in verses 15 through 20, where he talks about how do you deal with issues among each other. When one of you wrongs each other, how do you handle a situation like that in Christian community? He tells them, you go to that person. You let them know how they wronged you, to try to make amends, to reconcile with them. And then he gives them further steps beyond that. But you can't do that. You can't go to that person and seek reconciliation and forgiveness if you are not humble about the situation. Humility isn't about being a doormat for people to walk all over you. I don't want you to misunderstand what I'm saying here. That's not what humility is. Humility is about setting aside what you want so that another can be forgiven and begin the process of healing and reconciliation. Reconciliation and forgiveness are different, though. We need to understand that. You can forgive someone on your own without them ever wanting to be forgiven. If somebody wrongs you, they don't have to ask for your forgiveness for you to let that go and to forgive them of the wrong that they've done towards you. Reconciliation takes two. Forgiveness just takes one person. I think sometimes we lack the desire to be forgiving because we want there to be this necessary requirement that they want to be forgiven. Well, if they'll come and ask me for forgiveness, I'll be happy to forgive them. No, that's not how forgiveness works. That's reconciliation. That's not forgiveness. You can forgive somebody without them ever desiring it from you. That's a harder teaching, right? Because that requires all of you to say, I'm going to let that go. I'm going to let how they hurt me go. But it comes from being a forgiving person toward yourself as well. And this is one of those necessary steps also that I think we forget. I think it's all wrapped up and wound up with humility. That you have to be forgiving toward yourself. If you can't even forgive yourself for the things that you do wrong toward other people and toward God, I truly believe that you're going to fail at being a forgiving person toward other people. It's a necessary step to forgiving others, that you learn to forgive yourself first. So reconciliation takes two, forgiveness takes one. You got to start with yourself. But that's what Jesus hopes for in his community. That's what he teaches here about his community, that this is the way you should live. It's different from the world. The world still wants to hold on to the bookkeeping rules. You do for me, I'll do for you. You hurt me, guess what's coming? Vengeance is going to be yours. Or is going to be mine toward you, rather. Not so in the kingdom of heaven. A lot of grace, a lot of forgiveness we have to have. So, a few questions to close with and be done. And you can all go home and take your naps because you're all tired. It's not clicking. I don't know. Keep having issues this morning. Go ahead and put the first one up there if you will. How has God's forgiveness of you impacted your ability to forgive fellow believers? And again, this conversation that Jesus is having about forgiveness is about this community here, not all the people who didn't come today who need to be forgiven for not being here, but us right now. No, I'm kidding. How are we forgiving toward other people in our own community? And that can be hard, right? We can get frustrated at each other. We can be mad at each other when we feel like somebody has wronged us or wronged somebody that we're close to. That's hard to let go and forgive. Remember, it doesn't take them coming to ask for forgiveness for you to be able to forgive them. That only takes you. The second thing is, I have to push it. Are you still trying to keep score and forgiving someone in your life? That rule of bookkeeping. You trying to keep score. Well, you know what? I'll forgive them if they forgive me. That's not how forgiveness works. God is playing by a different rule, and we need to follow His example. And then the last one, have you learned to be humble like a child? That necessary step. Have you learned to be childish? It's probably not a question you expected me to ask of you this morning. Have you learned to be childish? To be humble like a child, like God, like Jesus instructed us to be. It's a necessary step to forgiveness, I think. That humility has to be deep in our core, part of our character. So that's forgiveness, at least in Matthew 18. That's what Jesus says about forgiveness. It's good news. I hope you see it as good news and not as some, oh my gosh, how am I ever going to get this right? I can never be what Jesus is asking me to be. You can. It's good news, I promise. Because when you learn to live and let go, you learn to forgive the wrongs that people have done towards you, that freedom, that weight is lifted off of you. Anybody else ever notice that? That when you learn to have forgiven somebody for a deep wrong, anybody else feel that weight lifted off? It feels good to be a forgiving person. The what does? The humble pie feels good. All I heard was the pie, and I was thinking, what is he talking about? I mean, pie tastes good. I'll agree with you on that. I just didn't know how a pie felt good. But yes, the humble pie. Humility, it starts with humility. I don't think it's any surprise that Jesus began this whole chapter talking about a child, being humble like a child. So let's be forgiving people this week toward each other when we're wronged. All right, it's good news this morning. It's the gospel this morning. We are few this morning, but if you need forgiveness, if you need a hug, if you need care this morning that we can give to you, we want to offer that. And we invite you to come forward as we stand and sing.